Greetings, traveler. You've arrived at a place where time slows down, and the worries of the day begin to fade. Here, we gather to listen to history told not in haste, but in a gentle rhythm meant to calm the mind. Perhaps you're ready to drift into sleep, or perhaps you simply wish for quiet company tonight. Either way, I'm so glad you're here. Tell me, where are you listening from, and what time of day accompanies your journey back through the ages? And if you find these soft retellings of the past comforting, a simple tap on subscribe ensures you'll never miss another night's tale. Now, breathe deeply, rest easily, and let us step into the stories waiting just beyond the veil of memory. Tonight, we sail backward through centuries, to a time when the boundaries between lawlessness and liberty blurred like the horizon where sea meets sky. We journey to an age when wooden vessels carved through endless blue expanses, their black flags snapping in salt-laden winds, their crews bound not by crown or country but by codes written in blood and brotherhood. This is the story of the Golden Age of Piracy, a brief and brilliant moment when outcasts and dreamers seized the freedom that empires denied them, when the ocean became a republic of rogues, and when men and women who had nothing built kingdoms on water and wind. Close your eyes, if you wish, and imagine the Caribbean Sea in the early 1700s. Picture waters so clear they seem made of liquid sapphire, islands rising from the waves like emeralds scattered by some careless god. The air hangs thick and warm, heavy with the scent of tropical flowers and the ever-present tang of salt. Palm trees sway in rhythms older than memory, their fronds whispering secrets to the trade winds that have guided sailors since time immemorial. Here, in these turquoise waters, in hidden coves and forgotten harbors, a different world was taking shape, one that existed in the margins of empires, in the spaces between laws, where ordinary rules dissolved like morning mist. The Golden Age of Piracy, as historians would come to call it, spans roughly from the 1660s through the 1720s, though its heart beats strongest in the years between 1715 and 1725. To understand this era, we must first step back and see the world that birthed it, for pirates do not emerge from nothing. They are symptoms of their age, reflections of the tensions and contradictions that simmer beneath the surface of civilized society. In the late 17th century, the Atlantic world was being remade. European powers, Spain, England, France, the Dutch Republic, were locked in an endless dance of commerce and conflict, building empires on the backs of enslaved peoples, extracting wealth from distant colonies, transforming the ocean into highways of gold and silver. Spanish galleons heavy with Peruvian silver and Mexican gold made their slow voyages across the Atlantic. English and French merchant vessels carried sugar, tobacco, rum, and human beings in chains. The sea had become the lifeblood of empires, and those who controlled it controlled the future. But empire building is messy work, full of contradictions. Nations that were allies one year became enemies the next. Wars flared and faded, treaties were signed and broken, and through it all, common sailors found themselves cast adrift in a world that used them and discarded them with equal indifference. When wars ended, thousands of privateer sailors, men who had been legally sanctioned to attack enemy shipping, suddenly found their licenses revoked, their services no longer required. They had spent years learning to hunt ships, to navigate by stars, to fight and plunder, and now they were expected to return quietly to lives of poverty and obedience. Many chose a different path. They kept sailing, kept hunting, but without the papers that made it legal. They became pirates, and in doing so, they stepped outside the system entirely, creating their own rough democracy on the waves. Let us drift now into the world as it was then. Let the details wash over you like warm water. Picture Port Royal, Jamaica, in the 1680s, before the great earthquake of 1692 sent much of it sliding into the sea. This was perhaps the wickedest city in the New World, a place where pirates walked openly in the streets, where taverns never closed and the rum flowed as freely as seawater. Buildings crowded together along narrow streets, their upper stories leaning drunkenly over cobblestones slick with spilled liquor and other, less pleasant substances. The air was thick with the smell of tobacco smoke, roasting meat, and the peculiar perfume of tropical decay that clings to all Caribbean ports. Here, in establishments with names like the Sign of the Mermaid or the Green Dragon, pirates would gather after successful raids, their pockets heavy with pieces of 8 and golden doubloons. They would drink and gamble and tell stories that grew taller with each retelling, spending in days what they had risked their lives for weeks to acquire. For the pirates' philosophy was simple: live for today, for tomorrow you might hang. They pursued pleasure with the same intensity they pursued prey, knowing that their lives burned bright and brief as matches struck in darkness. But Port Royal was more than just debauchery. It was also a marketplace, a crossroads where the legal and illegal economies met and mingled. Merchants who would never admit to dealing with pirates were happy to buy goods at reduced prices, no questions asked about their origin. Tavern keepers extended credit to crews preparing for voyages. Shipwrights repaired vessels without inquiring too closely about the damage. The entire town existed in a state of productive ambiguity, thriving on the chaos that empires tried so hard to contain. The pirates themselves came from everywhere and nowhere. They were English sailors who had deserted the Royal Navy, fleeing brutal discipline and starvation wages. They were African men who had escaped slavery or been freed when pirates captured slave ships, for many pirate crews were surprisingly integrated, offering a rough equality that existed nowhere else in that segregated age. They were French buccaneers from Hispaniola, men who had learned to survive on the edges of civilization. They were Scottish rebels, Irish transportes, Native Americans, mulattoes, mestizos. Every margin of society sent its outcasts to the sea, and the sea welcomed them all. Let us pause here and breathe in the complexity of this moment. The Golden Age of Piracy was not, as romantic tales might suggest, simply about adventure and treasure. It was about men and women who had been denied dignity by the world's legitimate powers and who seized it for themselves through force. It was about creating alternative communities in a world that offered them nothing. And yes, it was also about violence and theft, about cruelty and greed. Pirates were not heroes, but neither were they mere villains. They were human beings navigating impossible circumstances, making choices in a world where all options carried terrible costs. Consider the life of an ordinary sailor in the late 17th century. Perhaps he was pressed into service, kidnapped, essentially, by a Royal Navy crew desperate for men. He would find himself aboard a ship where discipline was enforced with the lash, where food was moldy and water was stagnant, where disease could sweep through the crew and kill half the men before they made port. He would be paid irregularly if at all, and when the voyage ended, he might be cast ashore in a foreign port with nothing but the clothes on his back. Is it any wonder that when such men encountered pirates, many chose to join them? For pirate ships operated on entirely different principles. Most were floating democracies where captains were elected and could be deposed by vote. Plunder was divided according to agreed-upon shares, with the captain and key officers receiving only slightly larger portions than common crew members. Before embarking on a voyage, the crew would draw up articles, written rules governing behavior, combat, and the division of spoils. These articles often included compensation for injuries received in battle, creating perhaps the first disability insurance in the Atlantic world. A man who lost a leg might receive 600 pieces of 8 or 6 slaves. The loss of a right arm was worth 600 pieces of 8, the loss of an eye or finger worth proportionally less but still substantial sums. Imagine the appeal of such arrangements to men who had known only hierarchy and exploitation. Aboard a merchant vessel or naval ship, a common sailor was nothing, a replaceable body whose suffering meant nothing to the officers and owners who profited from his labor. Aboard a pirate ship, he had a voice and a vote. He had the chance to become rich, or at least to live freely for a time. The pirates called themselves Brethren of the Coast, and there was genuine brotherhood in that title, a sense of solidarity born from shared danger and shared defiance. Let yourself drift deeper now, into the textures and rhythms of pirate life. Imagine awakening before dawn on a small sloop anchored in a secluded bay. The ship rocks gently on the swell, timbers creaking in their familiar language. Above, the stars are still brilliant in a sky not yet touched by sunrise, constellations that have guided sailors since ancient times. The air is cool, almost chilly, though the day will be hot. You rise from the hammock where you've slept, your body swaying automatically to compensate for the ship's movement, and you climb up onto the deck. Other men are already moving about, preparing for the day. Someone is coiling rope, the rough hemp sliding through calloused hands with practiced ease. Another is checking the rigging, his eyes scanning for any weakness that might prove fatal in a storm. The ship's carpenter is examining a section of the hull, looking for the telltale signs of worm damage that can devour a wooden ship from within. There is quiet conversation, low voices speaking in a mixture of English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese, with words borrowed from African languages and Native American tongues thrown in. This is a truly cosmopolitan community, united not by shared origin but by shared purpose. The cook, usually an injured man no longer fit for fighting, is preparing breakfast. Don't expect much, perhaps some salted pork fried in a pan, some ship's biscuit so hard you have to soak it in rum to make it edible, checking first for the weevils that infest all stored grain on long voyages. But there will be rum, certainly, for pirates consumed alcohol in quantities that would stagger modern sensibilities. Water stored in wooden barrels quickly became foul and dangerous to drink, but alcohol remained relatively safe, and so the pirates' day began and ended with spirits. As the sun rises, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the ship comes fully alive. If you are at anchor, there is work to be done, sails to be mended, ropes to be repaired, weapons to be cleaned and sharpened. Pirates kept their ships in fighting trim, for their survival depended on being able to outrun naval vessels or overtake merchant ships. Every man had his duties, and those who shirked them would face the crew's justice, which could be harsh indeed. Some infractions called for marooning. Being left alone on a deserted island with only a pistol containing a single shot, allowing the condemned man the choice between a slow death from starvation or a quick death by his own hand. But if there is a sail on the horizon, everything changes. The lookout in the crow's nest, often the youngest member of the crew, with the sharpest eyes, calls down his sighting. The captain and quartermaster study the distant vessel through spyglasses, trying to determine if she is worth pursuing. Is she heavily laden, riding low in the water with valuable cargo? Or is she light and fast, not worth the chase? Can they determine her nationality? Spanish ships are prized above all, for Spain's colonies are rich, but French and English vessels can also yield good plunder. If the decision is made to give chase, the ship transforms into an instrument of pursuit. Every sail is set to catch the maximum wind. Men scramble up the rigging with the agility of monkeys, their bare feet finding purchase on swaying ropes. The ship heels over as she catches the wind, and suddenly you are flying across the water, the bow throwing up sheets of spray, the deck tilting at a sharp angle. This is the moment when all the tedium and hardship of sailing dissolves into pure exhilaration. This is why men choose this life, for these moments when they feel utterly alive, poised on the knife edge between triumph and disaster. The chase might last hours or even days. Pirates are patient hunters, and they know that merchant crews will often surrender without a fight if they realize resistance is hopeless. As they close with their prey, the pirates prepare for battle. Weapons are distributed: cutlasses, boarding axes, pistols, and muskets. Some men tie strips of cloth around their heads to keep sweat from their eyes. Others might take a swig of rum for courage. The captain might order the raising of the black flag, the Jolly Roger as it would come to be called, to signal their intentions and give the merchant crew a chance to surrender peacefully. These flags deserve a moment of our attention, for they have become the most enduring symbol of piracy. Each captain often had his own design, but certain motifs recurred: skulls and crossbones, skeletons holding hourglasses or spears, hearts dripping blood. These images were not chosen randomly. They were psychological weapons, designed to inspire terror and communicate a simple message: surrender or die. Time is running out. Death is coming for you. Better to give up your cargo and live than to resist and perish. Some flags were more specific in their threats. Bartholomew Roberts, one of the most successful pirates of the age, flew a flag showing himself standing on two skulls, labeled ABH and AMH, a Barbadian's head, and a Martiniquean's head, signaling his particular hatred for the authorities of those islands who had dared to resist him. Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, sometimes flew a flag depicting a skeleton spearing a heart while toasting the devil, an image calculated to inspire maximum dread. But let us pause in this moment of approach, before violence erupts, and consider what happened when a merchant ship surrendered, as most did. The pirates would swarm aboard, weapons at the ready, and begin their work. They were looking for several things. First, obvious valuables: gold, silver, gemstones, coins of any nation. Second, trade goods that could be easily sold: sugar, tobacco, indigo, cacao, fine cloth. Third, supplies: food, water, rum, gunpowder, weapons, rope, canvas for sails, tools. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly in the long run, recruits. Pirates were always losing men to combat, disease, desertion, and the occasional hanging. They needed fresh blood, and a captured merchant ship was an excellent recruiting ground. The pirates would interrogate the captured crew, asking about their treatment by the officers. Were they fed adequately? Paid fairly? Beaten regularly? Often, merchant sailors were treated abysmally, and many would eagerly join the pirates if given the chance. Those who refused were generally released unharmed, sent on their way with the captured ship, now stripped of valuables, and a story to tell in the next port. The treatment of captured officers was more variable. If the captain and mates had been cruel to their crew, the pirates might administer rough justice, flogging them or subjecting them to humiliating punishments. If they had been fair and decent, they were usually treated well. Pirates were not mindlessly violent. Their cruelty, when it appeared, was often calculated and purposeful, designed to send messages and maintain their fearsome reputation. Let us follow now the story of a captured merchant sailor who chooses to join the pirates. His name is Thomas. We'll give him that simple name, though he could be John or William or James or any of the common names that filled ships' rosters. Thomas has spent the last year aboard a merchant vessel trading between Bristol and Jamaica, enduring poor food, brutal officers, and the constant threat of disease. When the pirates swarm aboard and offer him a chance to join them, he hesitates only a moment before saying yes. He signs the articles, takes his oath, and suddenly he is transformed from victim to participant in this alternate society. Thomas quickly learns the rhythm of pirate life. It is not the constant action depicted in adventure stories. Much of it is tedious, sailing from place to place, looking for prey, maintaining the ship, dealing with the thousand small crises that arise when wooden vessels challenge the ocean. But there are also moments of intensity that burn bright in memory. There are successful captures that fill the hold with plunder. There are close escapes from naval vessels. There are storms that test every man's courage. There are nights in hidden anchorages where the crew gathers to sing and drink and tell stories, feeling themselves free in a way that exists nowhere else in their world. Thomas learns to navigate by the stars, reading the heavens the way other men read books. He learns the tricks of sailing in tropical waters, how to read the color of the sea to know what depth lies beneath, how to predict storms from the behavior of seabirds, how to find fresh water on seemingly barren islands. He learns to fight with cutlass and pistol, though he discovers that most battles are won before the first blow is struck, by reputation and intimidation. He learns the codes and customs of the pirate brotherhood, the unwritten rules that govern interactions between different crews. For the pirate world, though lawless by definition, had its own laws and structures. Different crews recognized each other's hunting grounds, after a fashion. When two pirate ships met, their captains might exchange news and rum, comparing notes about which ports were safe and which were too hot with naval patrols. There was honor among these thieves, or at least a practical recognition that some forms of cooperation served everyone's interests. Pirates who betrayed their fellows or broke the codes could find themselves ostracized, unable to find crew or refuge, effectively sentenced to death by the very community they had wronged. Let us drift now toward some of the most famous names of the Golden Age, for while every pirate has a story worth telling, some became legends whose tales have echoed through centuries. We will linger with them a while, not rushing, letting their lives unfold like flowers opening to the sun. Consider Henry Avery, sometimes called Long Ben or the Arch-Pirate, whose career set the template for many who followed. Avery was born in Devon, England, likely in the 1650s, and spent his youth as a sailor in the Royal Navy and on merchant ships. By the 1690s, he was serving as first mate aboard a privateer vessel in the Spanish West Indies. But the ship's owners failed to pay the crew, leaving them stranded and desperate. Avery, seeing an opportunity, organized a mutiny. One night in May of 1694, while the captain lay drunk in his cabin, Avery and his conspirators seized control of the ship, renamed her the Fancy, and turned pirate. Avery proved himself a remarkable leader and navigator. Rather than stay in the Caribbean where naval patrols were common, he set course across the Atlantic, around the Cape of Good Hope, and into the Indian Ocean. This was a brilliant strategic move. The Indian Ocean was far from European naval power, and the ships that sailed its waters, carrying goods between India, Arabia, and Africa, were often rich beyond imagination but poorly defended. In September of 1695, near the entrance to the Red Sea, Avery's Fancy encountered a convoy of ships belonging to the Mughal Emperor of India. After a brief chase, Avery captured the Ganges Sawai, a grand vessel carrying pilgrims returning from Mecca along with an enormous treasure. The exact value of the prize remains uncertain, but contemporary accounts suggest it may have included £600,000 sterling in gold and silver, along with gems and jewels. This was wealth beyond comprehension, enough to make every man in Avery's crew rich for life. What followed was darker. Avery's men tortured some of the crew and passengers to force them to reveal where they had hidden valuables, and several women aboard were raped. This brutality, common enough in the violent world of the 1700s, nevertheless damaged Avery's reputation among pirates who prided themselves on a certain rough code of honor. But it mattered little to Avery himself, who now had the problem of what to do with his enormous wealth. He sailed to the Bahamas, distributed the treasure among his crew, and then simply vanished. Despite an international manhunt, the East India Company was furious, and the Mughal Emperor threatened to retaliate against English trading interests in India. Avery was never captured. Some stories say he lived out his days in England under an assumed name. Others claim he was cheated by merchants who promised to fence his stolen goods and died in poverty. The truth remains one of history's mysteries. But his example inspired countless others. Here was proof that a pirate could strike it rich and escape justice, living to enjoy his ill-gotten gains. Now let your mind drift southward and forward in time, to the early 1700s, to the waters around Madagascar and the Red Sea, where another legendary pirate held court. Captain William Kidd's story is more tragic than triumphant, a tale of how the line between privateer and pirate could blur with fatal consequences. Kidd was born in Scotland around 1655 and established himself as a respectable sea captain in New York, marrying a wealthy widow and becoming a pillar of colonial society. In 1695, he was commissioned by a group of English nobles and merchants to hunt pirates in the Indian Ocean and to capture French ships. England and France were at war at the time. This was legal privateering, sanctioned by the Crown. Kidd was given a ship, the Adventure Galley, and he set out with high hopes of making his fortune honestly. But everything went wrong. His crew, recruited largely from the taverns of London, proved unruly and mutinous. Months passed without a significant capture, and the men grew restless. Kidd was caught between his commission, which authorized him to attack only pirates and French vessels, and his crew's demands for plunder. The line became increasingly blurred. When they encountered a ship, questions of nationality and legitimacy seemed less important than the cargo she carried. In January 1698, after a heated argument, Kidd struck and killed his gunner William Moore with a wooden bucket, a moment of violence that would come to haunt him. Later that year, he captured the Quebec Merchant, an Armenian ship sailing under French passes. By the technical letter of his commission, this might have been legal, but the cargo belonged to influential Indian merchants, and the political ramifications were disastrous. When Kidd eventually returned to the colonies, he found that he had been declared a pirate. His backers had abandoned him to save their own reputations. He was arrested, sent to England, and tried for piracy and murder. The trial was a farce, with much of the evidence that might have exonerated him mysteriously disappearing. In May 1701, Kidd was hanged at Execution Dock in London. The rope broke on the first attempt, and he had to be hanged a second time, his body left to dangle in chains for years as a warning to other sailors. His case illustrated the dangerous hypocrisy of the age. The same governments that condemned piracy also employed privateers to do their dirty work, then disavowed them when politics demanded. But let us move away from tragedy for a moment and drift toward the Caribbean, to the years just after the War of Spanish Succession ended in 1713. Peace was declared, and thousands of privateers who had been happily attacking Spanish shipping with official sanction suddenly found themselves unemployed. Many turned to piracy, and the Caribbean became more dangerous than it had been in decades. This was the moment when Nassau, in the Bahamas, became the pirate capital of the Atlantic world. The town had been largely abandoned by respectable settlers after a Spanish raid in 1703. Pirates moved in to fill the vacuum, and by 1716, over 1,000 pirates called Nassau home. They elected their own governor, a colorful character named Benjamin Hornigold, and established a republic of rogues that existed completely outside the law. Picture Nassau in its pirate heyday. The harbor is filled with ships of every description, sloops and brigantines and schooners, some flying no flag, others flying the black. On shore, ramshackle buildings line sandy streets. Taverns operate around the clock, their doors never closing, rum flowing in rivers. There are no courts, no churches, no institutions of civil society, only the rough democracy of armed men who have rejected civilization's constraints. Disputes are settled with fists or blades. Justice is swift and harsh. But there is also a strange sort of freedom here, a sense of possibility that exists nowhere else. It was from Nassau that some of the most notorious pirates of the age operated. Charles Vane, whose cruelty earned him a fearsome reputation, sailed from Nassau, capturing dozens of ships and burning some just for the terror it inspired. Calico Jack, Rackham used Nassau as his base, though he would become more famous for the 2 women who sailed with him than for his own relatively modest piratical achievements. And it was in Nassau that Edward Teach, who would become Blackbeard, the most feared pirate of them all, honed his craft and built his legend. Let us linger with Blackbeard for a while, for his story captures something essential about the Golden Age of piracy. Teach was probably born in Bristol, England, around 1680, though like many details of pirate lives, this is uncertain. He served on privateer ships during the War of Spanish Succession, learning the skills he would later put to infamous use. By 1716, he was sailing under Benjamin Hornigold, who recognized young Teach's potential and eventually gave him command of a captured sloop. Teach began building his terrifying persona. He grew his beard long and wild, braiding it and tying the braids with colored ribbons. Before battle, he would tuck slow-burning matches, lengths of hemp cord soaked in saltpeter, under his hat and light them, so that his head appeared to be wreathed in smoke, like a demon emerging from hell. He cultivated a reputation for mercilessness, though in reality he was more calculating than cruel. He understood that if a pirate could inspire sufficient terror, victims would surrender without a fight, minimizing casualties on both sides. In 1717, Teach captured a large French slave ship, the Concorde, which he renamed Queen Anne's Revenge and outfitted with 40 guns, making her one of the most powerful pirate vessels in the Atlantic. With this floating fortress, he terrorized the shipping lanes from the Caribbean to the American colonies. His blockade of Charleston, South Carolina, in May 1718 was audacious. He held the port hostage, capturing several ships and taking prominent citizens prisoner, demanding a chest of medicine in ransom. The authorities complied, humiliated by their inability to resist. But Blackbeard's career was brief. By late 1718, he had accepted a pardon from the governor of North Carolina and was attempting to retire, though he apparently couldn't resist the occasional bit of piracy on the side. The governor of Virginia, Alexander Spotswood, decided Blackbeard had to be eliminated. He commissioned 2 sloops under Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy to hunt the pirate down. They found Blackbeard anchored at Ocracoke Island in November 1718. What followed was one of the most famous sea battles in pirate history. Maynard's sloops approached flying no colors, trying to appear as merchant vessels. Blackbeard was not fooled. As the sloops closed in, he unleashed a devastating broadside, killing or wounding many of Maynard's men. But Maynard had ordered most of his crew to hide below decks, and when Blackbeard boarded what he thought was a crippled vessel, he walked into a trap. The fighting was vicious and close quarters, cutlasses ringing against cutlasses, pistols firing at point-blank range. Blackbeard fought like a demon, receiving 5 pistol shots and 20 cutlass wounds before he finally fell. Maynard had his head cut off and hung from the bowsprit of his sloop as proof of the deed and as a grim trophy. Thus ended Blackbeard, dead at perhaps 38 years old, having sailed as a pirate for barely 2 years but having achieved immortality. Let yourself rest now in the rhythm of waves, in the steady breathing of the sea. We have traveled far and met many souls, but there are more stories yet to tell, more lives that burn bright and brief in this strange era. Consider for a moment the question of women in this masculine world. The sea was considered no place for women, and most pirate articles explicitly forbade bringing women aboard, fearing they would cause jealousy and discord. Yet women found their way onto pirate ships regardless, and some became pirates themselves, as fierce and capable as any man. And Bonnie was born in Ireland around 1700, the illegitimate daughter of a lawyer and a maid. Her father emigrated to Carolina, where he prospered, but was wild and unmanageable. She married a small-time pirate named James Bonny and moved to Nassau, where she met Calico Jack Rackham. The two began an affair, and when Jack returned to piracy after briefly accepting a pardon, and joined him, disguising herself as a man and proving herself in combat. Aboard Jack's ship, she met Mary Red, another woman living as a male pirate. Mary's story was even more remarkable. She had been raised as a boy by her mother, who needed to pass her off as a dead older brother to continue receiving support from the child's grandmother, and had grown accustomed to male dress and male freedom. She had served as a soldier in the army, fought with distinction, then joined a ship's crew and eventually turned pirate. When she and Anne discovered each other's true sex, they formed a close bond, some sources suggesting a romantic one, though the truth is lost to time. In October 1720, Jack Rackham's ship was surprised by a pirate hunter off the coast of Jamaica. Most of the crew was drunk below decks when the attack came. According to trial records, only Bonnie and Mary Red stood on deck fighting when the boarding party arrived, and reportedly called down to the men cowering below, "If there's a man among ye, you'll come up and fight like the men ye are to be." But no one came, and the ship was captured. Jack and his crew were tried and hanged. Mary Red escaped execution by pleading her belly, revealing she was pregnant, which under English law granted a stay of execution. She died in prison of fever before she could be hanged. And Bonnie also claimed pregnancy and received a stay. She then simply vanishes from historical records, her fate unknown. Some sources claim her wealthy father ransomed her and took her back to Carolina, where she lived quietly under a different name. Others say she died in prison like Mary. We will never know for certain. These women fascinate us precisely because they were anomalies, cracks in the rigid gender roles of their time. They demonstrated that the qualities pirates needed, courage, strength, strategic thinking, ruthlessness when necessary, were not inherently male. In the strange democracy of pirate ships, freed temporarily from society's usual hierarchies, even gender could become negotiable. Let us drift now toward the African dimension of this story, which is too often overlooked. The Caribbean and the Atlantic trade routes were deeply entangled with the slave trade, that great crime of the early modern world. Pirates captured slave ships regularly, and when they did, they faced a choice: keep the enslaved people to sell for profit, or free them and invite them to join the crew. Different pirates made different choices, and we should not romanticize this. Many pirates were perfectly willing to sell human beings for profit. But others did offer freedom, and many African men seized that opportunity, joining pirate crews and earning the same shares as white crew members. Some became prominent pirates in their own right. Diego de los Reyes, known as Diego the Mulatto, was a buccaneer of mixed African and Spanish heritage who became famous for his raids along the Spanish Main in the mid-1600s. Black Caesar, who may have been an African chieftain captured by slavers before escaping and turning pirate, operated in the waters around the Florida Keys for years, supposedly using a hidden base on Caesar's Rock. Samuel Bellamy, captain of the pirate ship Whydah, had a pilot named John Julian, a Mosquito Indian, and his crew was remarkably diverse, including numerous men of African descent. When the Whydah wrecked off Cape Cod in 1717, taking Bellamy and most of his crew to a watery grave, 9 survivors made it to shore. They were captured and put on trial. 6 were hanged, but among those who escaped the noose was Thomas Davis, a Welsh carpenter who claimed he had been forced into piracy. Also surviving was an African man known only as John, who was not hanged but was instead sold into slavery in Virginia. The irony is bitter. In the pirate crew, John had been free and equal; in the hands of justice, he was property. The presence of black pirates challenges our assumptions about race in the 18th century. It doesn't mean pirates were enlightened anti-racists; they weren't. Racism was pervasive in their era, and pirates shared the prejudices of their time. But pirate ships needed skilled men more than they needed racial purity, and practical necessity could create spaces where hierarchies temporarily dissolved. For men escaping slavery, piracy offered one of the few paths to genuine freedom in a world built on bondage. Let yourself sink deeper now into the sensory world of these sailors. Imagine the feel of a ship beneath you in a storm, the deck tilting at impossible angles, waves washing over the bow, wind howling through the rigging like tortured spirits. Imagine the taste of fear in your mouth as you cling to whatever handhold you can find, knowing that if you are swept overboard, no one can save you. The ocean is dark and infinite, and you are a tiny creature on a fragile vessel of wood and rope and canvas, entirely at the mercy of forces beyond your control. Or imagine the opposite, a perfect sailing day, when the wind is steady and the sea is calm, when the ship seems to fly across the water, and the sun is warm on your face, and you feel that you could sail forever, that the world is endless and yours to explore. These moments of grace make the hardships bearable. They remind you why humans have always been drawn to the sea, despite its dangers. Pirate life was a constant negotiation with discomfort and danger. Fresh water was a precious commodity, rationed carefully and tasting of the wooden barrels that held it. Food grew monotonous, salt pork or beef so hard it had to be soaked before it could be chewed, ship's biscuit riddled with weevils. Sailors would tap the biscuit against the table and eat it in darkness so they couldn't see the insects. Sometimes they would catch fish or turtles to supplement their diet. When they landed on islands, they would hunt wild pigs or birds, gather coconuts and fruits, anything to break the tedium of salt meat and hardtack. Disease was an ever-present specter. Yellow fever could sweep through a crew, turning men's skin the color of old parchment, causing black vomit and death. Malaria brought fevers that made men shake and hallucinate. Dysentery struck without warning, leaving men too weak to stand. Scurvy was the particular curse of long voyages, caused by lack of fresh fruits and vegetables, making gums bleed and old wounds reopen, and eventually bringing death. Pirates who lingered too long at sea without making port to resupply often lost more men to disease than to combat. And yet men chose this life. They chose it because the alternatives were worse. They chose it because for a brief time, they could taste a freedom that existed nowhere else in their world. They chose it because they could vote for their officers, challenge authority, live by codes they helped create. They chose it because even the risk of hanging seemed preferable to a life of grinding poverty and powerlessness ashore. Consider the ritual of marooning, which pirates used as punishment for serious transgressions. The condemned men would be taken to a deserted island, and the Caribbean was full of such places, small sand and coral atolls with no fresh water, no shelter, nothing but sun and sea and sky. He would be left with a pistol containing a single shot, a bottle of water, and perhaps a little food. The implicit message was clear: you can drag out your death for days as thirst and exposure take you, or you can end it quickly with that one bullet. Some marooned men survived, rescued by passing ships or managing to signal to vessels they spotted on the horizon. But most did not. Their bones were scattered by wind and scavenging birds, unmarked and unmourned. Yet this harsh justice coexisted with remarkable generosity within the pirate community. When a man was injured in battle, his shipmates cared for him as best they could, though medical knowledge was primitive and surgery often meant amputation without anesthesia. The patient held down by strong arms while the surgeon, often just the ship's carpenter, the man most skilled with sharp tools, sawed through bone. If a man died, his share of the plunder would go to his designated beneficiary, assuming he had named one. Pirates understood that they depended on each other absolutely, and this fostered a rough solidarity that transcended the usual divisions of class and sometimes even race. Let us turn now to Bartholomew Roberts, known as Black Bart, who represents perhaps the peak of pirate success and sophistication. Roberts was born in Wales around 1682 and spent decades as an honest sailor before fate thrust him into piracy. In June 1719, his ship was captured by pirates off the coast of Africa. The pirate captain, Howell Davis, forced Roberts and other skilled men to join his crew. Davis was killed in an ambush a few weeks later, and the crew elected Roberts as their new captain, despite his protests that he had never wanted to be a pirate. Once committed to the life, however, Roberts embraced it fully and proved himself the most successful pirate of the Golden Age. Over the next 3 years, he captured more than 400 vessels, ranging from small fishing boats to rich merchantmen and even naval escorts. His success came from brilliant strategy and iron discipline. He kept his crew sober during working hours, forbade gambling that might lead to quarrels, enforced strict rules about combat and plunder. His men grumbled about these restrictions but followed him because he made them rich. Roberts had a flair for the theatrical. He dressed elegantly, wearing fine coats and plumed hats, adorning himself with gold chains and jewelry. He was educated and literate, unusual in that time for a man of his background, and he composed his own ballads celebrating his exploits. He was also ruthless when circumstances demanded. When the governor of Martinique sent warships to hunt him, Roberts captured several vessels from that island and hanged their crews, making clear that resistance would be punished severely. In February 1722, Roberts was sailing off the coast of West Africa when he encountered HMS Swallow, a naval warship. Roberts prepared to fight, confident in his ship's firepower and his crew's skill. But the battle went badly from the start. A blast of grapeshot from the Swallow struck Roberts in the throat, killing him almost instantly. His crew, following his standing orders, threw his body overboard in full regalia so that his corpse would never hang in chains as a warning to others. The Swallow captured the crew, and 54 men were hanged at Cape Coast Castle in what was the largest pirate trial and execution in history. Thus ended Black Bart, dead at perhaps 40, having packed a lifetime of adventure and infamy into less than 3 years. The death of Roberts marked a turning point. By 1722, the Golden Age was entering its twilight. The factors that had created the pirate explosion were changing. European powers, tired of having their commerce disrupted, were committing serious resources to suppressing piracy. Naval patrols increased. Pirate hunters like Woodes Rogers in the Bahamas were bringing law to formerly lawless ports. Colonies that had tolerated pirates because they brought money were now being pressured to crack down. The web was tightening. Woodes Rogers deserves our attention, for he represents the forces that would ultimately destroy the pirate republic. Rogers was himself a former privateer who had circumnavigated the globe, rescuing the castaway Alexander Selkirk, who would inspire Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe along the way. In 1718, he was appointed governor of the Bahamas with explicit orders to end piracy in Nassau. Rogers arrived with a combination of carrot and stick. He brought royal pardons for any pirate who would surrender and renounce piracy. For those who refused, he brought warships and soldiers. Many pirates, tired of the constant danger and attracted by the promise of amnesty, accepted the pardon. Benjamin Hornigold, the former pirate governor of Nassau, became a pirate hunter for Rogers. Others, like Charles Vane, refused to submit and sailed away to continue their depredations elsewhere, though Vane would eventually be captured and hanged. Rogers faced enormous challenges. The pirates who remained in Nassau resisted him, and he had to fight several skirmishes before establishing control. His soldiers died of disease in appalling numbers. The British government failed to send him adequate supplies or money, leaving him to pay expenses from his own pocket. But slowly, through determination and strategy, he transformed Nassau from pirate haven to British colony. By 1720, the pirate republic was finished, and Nassau had courts and churches and all the apparatus of civilization. Picture Rogers standing on the shore as former pirates worked to fortify the harbor, building the very defenses that would keep their old comrades out. Picture the psychological complexity of this moment, men who had rejected authority now working for it, men who had been free now accepting the constraints of law and order. Some must have felt relief, happy to escape the constant danger of pirate life. Others must have felt a profound sense of loss, mourning the death of a dream, the closing of a space where different rules applied. But not all pirates surrendered or were captured. Some sailed to remote corners of the Atlantic world and continued their trade, though on a smaller scale. A few made it to Madagascar, that legendary pirate haven in the Indian Ocean, where they could live out their days in reasonable safety. Others simply disappeared, blending into colonial societies under assumed names, carrying their secrets to unmarked graves. Let us drift now into the mythology that grew up around these pirates even during their lifetimes. Newspapers reported their exploits with a mixture of horror and fascination. Broadsheets and ballads celebrated the most notorious captains, transforming them into folk heroes even as authorities hanged them. There was something about pirates that captured the popular imagination, perhaps because they represented a fantasy of freedom that resonated with people trapped in rigid social hierarchies. The most influential mythmaking came from a book published in 1724, A General History of the Robberies and Murders of the Most Notorious Pirates. The author identified himself as Captain Charles Johnson, though many scholars now believe this was a pseudonym for Daniel Defoe or another professional writer. The book collected stories of famous pirates, some based on trial records and newspaper reports, others clearly embellished or invented outright. It was enormously popular, going through multiple editions and translations, and it established the pirate archetypes that persist to this day: the democratic pirate ship, the buried treasure, the colorful captains with their distinctive flags and dramatic gestures. How much of this was true? That question is harder to answer than you might think. Pirates rarely kept written records, illiteracy was common, and even literate pirates had good reason not to document their crimes. Most of what we know comes from trial transcripts, newspaper accounts, and books like Johnson's General History, all of which had their own biases and agendas. Trials were theatrical events meant to demonstrate government power. Newspapers exaggerated for commercial reasons. Johnson was writing entertainment, not sober history. Yet beneath the myths lie authentic human experiences. We know that pirate crews did elect their captains and vote on major decisions. This appears in too many independent sources to be fabrication. We know they drew up articles governing behavior and dividing plunder. Actual articles have survived from several ships. We know they were ethnically diverse. Trial records confirm this repeatedly. We know many came from merchant and naval crews. Court testimonies document this pattern. So while specific stories may be embellished, the general picture has validity. The truth is that pirates were neither the romantic heroes of fiction nor the simple villains of official propaganda. They were complex human beings responding to complex circumstances. They committed acts of violence and theft, causing real suffering to their victims. They also created communities based on principles of democracy and rough equality that were radical for their time. They were products of an unjust world who responded to injustice by creating their own injustices. They were, in other words, thoroughly human. Let yourself float now on these contradictions, for they are what make history interesting. A pirate who fights for freedom while enslaving others. A democratic crew that resolves disputes with violence. Men who live by codes of honor while stealing for a living. These paradoxes remind us that human beings are rarely consistent, that we contain multitudes, that the line between hero and villain is often blurred beyond recognition. Consider the impact piracy had on the legitimate world. The economic costs were substantial. Merchants lost cargoes, insurance rates increased, trade routes had to be adjusted or protected by convoy. But piracy also forced improvements in naval technology and tactics. The need to chase down fast pirate sloops drove innovation in ship design. The challenge of suppressing piracy led to better coordination between colonies and improved maritime law. In a perverse way, pirates contributed to the development of the very system they opposed. Piracy also had cultural impacts that rippled outward in unexpected ways. The mixing of peoples on pirate ships, English, French, Spanish, Dutch, African, Native American, created a Creole culture that influenced language, music, and customs throughout the Caribbean. Pirates spread news and gossip between ports that had little other communication. They provided markets for smuggled goods in colonies where official trade was restricted. They were agents of chaos, certainly, but chaos is not always unproductive. Let us visit now one of the lesser-known but fascinating pirate communities, the brief republic established on Madagascar. This large island off the east coast of Africa became a haven for pirates operating in the Indian Ocean in the late 1600s. The western coast had several natural harbors, fresh water, abundant food from both land and sea, and indigenous populations willing to trade with the newcomers. Best of all, it was thousands of miles from any European authority capable of interfering. By the 1690s, hundreds of pirates had settled in Madagascar, establishing small settlements and taking local wives. They built simple houses, planted gardens, and created a strange hybrid culture, neither European nor African but something new. Some attempted to establish permanent kingdoms, declaring themselves rulers and trying to organize the local population. Most of these grandiose schemes collapsed, but for a time, Madagascar offered pirates something rare, a place to retire, to escape the cycle of violence and live out their days in relative peace. One of the most intriguing figures in Madagascar was a man named James Plantin, who around 1720 established himself on the small island of Nosy Be off Madagascar's northwest coast. Plantin built a fort, gathered a following of about 30 European pirates and numerous local allies, and declared himself King of Ranter Bay. He minted his own coins, flew his own flag, and supposedly lived in high style. His kingdom lasted only a few years before collapsing into dysfunction, but it represents the pirate dream taken to its logical conclusion: complete independence, a society built from nothing, freedom transformed into sovereignty. Most of the Madagascar pirates were less ambitious. They simply wanted to live without constantly looking over their shoulders for naval vessels or pirate hunters. They wanted to enjoy their plunder in peace, to father children and grow old, luxuries that pirate life rarely afforded. Some succeeded, others found that paradise had its own challenges. Disease was rampant. Relations with local populations could turn hostile. Without the discipline of ship life, some men drank themselves to death or descended into violence. Freedom, it turned out, was harder to manage than they had anticipated. By the early 1700s, the Madagascar pirate community was fading. Some men died, others returned to the Atlantic, a few were captured when naval patrols finally reached even these remote waters. The settlements emptied, leaving only ruins and stories. Today, almost nothing remains except legends of buried treasure that have drawn fortune hunters for centuries, though few have found anything but disappointment. The idea of buried treasure deserves a moment of examination, for it has become one of the most enduring pirate myths. In reality, pirates rarely buried their plunder. The whole point of piracy was to acquire wealth to spend, and most pirates burned through their shares as fast as they acquired them. Why would a man bury gold when he could use it to buy rum and pleasure and a brief respite from hardship? The notion of treasure maps and buried chests comes largely from fiction, particularly Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, published in 1883, more than a century after the Golden Age ended. That said, there is one confirmed case of buried pirate treasure. William Kidd, during his desperate flight from justice, reportedly buried some of his wealth on Gardiner's Island off Long Island, New York. He apparently hoped to use it as a bargaining chip to negotiate a pardon, and he gave the island's proprietor a receipt for the goods. When Kidd was arrested, authorities recovered this treasure, gold, silver, and jewels worth perhaps £10,000, and used it as evidence against him. So the legend has some basis in fact, even if the reality is less romantic than fiction suggests. Let us turn our attention now to the technical side of piracy, the ships themselves and the tactics used to hunt and capture prey. Pirates favored fast, maneuverable vessels over heavily armed but slow ships. Sloops were particularly popular, single-masted vessels with fore and aft rigging that could sail close to the wind and navigate shallow waters where larger ships could not follow. A good sloop might be 60 to 70 feet long, carry 60 to 80 men, and mount 8 to 12 cannon. She could outrun most merchant ships and even some naval vessels, and her shallow draft meant she could escape into coastal waters or among islands. Pirates maintained their ships obsessively because their lives depended on their vessels' performance. They would regularly careen their ships, beaching them at high tide and then waiting for the tide to recede, leaving the vessel on its side so the hull could be scraped clean of barnacles and weed. This growth, if left unchecked, could slow a ship dramatically, meaning the difference between catching prey and going hungry, between escape and capture. The careening process was also when they would repair any damage and apply pitch to seal leaks. It was hard, hot work, but essential. In terms of tactics, pirates relied on psychological warfare as much as actual combat. A merchant ship that saw a pirate vessel approaching had limited options. She could try to flee, though pirates generally had faster ships and could pursue for days if necessary. She could try to fight, though merchant vessels were lightly armed and their crews had little combat training. Or she could surrender immediately, hoping for mercy. Pirates encouraged the last option by cultivating terrifying reputations. If word spread that a particular pirate captain killed crews that resisted but spared those who surrendered, merchant sailors would be more likely to give up without a fight. Violence, paradoxically, was often unnecessary precisely because of the threat of violence. When combat did occur, it followed certain patterns. As the pirate vessel closed with its prey, the pirates would fire their cannon, aiming not to sink the merchant ship, that would destroy the cargo they wanted, but to disable her rigging or terrify her crew. They would fire chain shot. 2 cannonballs connected by a chain that would spin through the air and shred sails and rigging. They would fire bar shot, similar in principle but using iron bars, or simply load their cannon with scrap metal and nails, turning them into giant shotguns. The goal was to slow the merchant vessel and demoralize her crew. Once close enough, the pirates would use grappling hooks to lash the 2 ships together, then swarm aboard in a screaming wave. The boarding party would be heavily armed. Each man might carry multiple pistols. Single-shot weapons were discarded after firing rather than reloaded in the heat of battle, along with a cutlass or boarding axe for close combat. The initial assault was usually decisive. Merchant crews, faced with dozens of armed and experienced fighters, typically threw down their weapons and surrendered. Actual melees were rare, though when they did occur, they were vicious affairs fought in confined spaces with no quarter given or expected. Pirates also used deception as a tactical tool. They would fly false flags. Any ship could carry flags from different nations and raise whichever was convenient. A pirate might approach flying English colors to avoid alarming an English merchant ship, then run up the Jolly Roger at the last moment when escape was impossible. Some pirates took this further, disguising their vessels as merchant ships, hiding extra crew below decks and covering gun ports until the moment of attack. These tactics worked because the ocean was a confusing place where identifying ships at a distance was difficult and dangerous mistakes were common. Now let your thoughts drift toward the end of this era, toward the forces that brought the Golden Age to its close. By the mid-1720s, piracy was in steep decline. The reasons were multiple and reinforcing. First, the European powers had committed to suppression, sending more warships and more aggressive commanders to hunt pirates down. Second, colonies that had tolerated pirates were no longer willing to do so, either from moral conviction or from pressure by their home governments. Third, the economic conditions that had created piracy were changing. Naval demobilization after the War of Spanish Succession had stabilized, legitimate employment opportunities had improved, and the chaos of the post-war years had settled. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, the pirates themselves had created the conditions for their own destruction. Every successful raid made merchants demand more protection. Every atrocity hardened public opinion against piracy. Every defiant gesture prompted harsher responses. Pirates had thrived in the gaps and margins of imperial power, but now those margins were closing. The ocean was being tamed, brought under control, made safe for commerce. There was simply less space for piracy to exist. The end, when it came, was not a single dramatic moment but a gradual fading. One by one, the great captains were killed or captured. Crews that escaped destruction found it harder to recruit, harder to find ports that would tolerate them, harder to sell their plunder. Some pirates accepted pardons and tried to go straight, with varying degrees of success. Others were hunted down in their final refuges. A few simply disappeared, their fates unknown. By 1730, organized piracy had been largely eliminated from the Atlantic world. There would still be pirates, there always have been and probably always will be as long as there are ships and cargo, but never again would pirates operate so openly, control whole ports, or pose a serious threat to imperial commerce. The Golden Age was over, though its legends were just beginning. Let us rest for a moment in the quiet after a storm, in the strange peace that follows violence. Imagine standing on a beach in the Caribbean, perhaps on Nassau, decades after the pirates are gone. The harbor is filled with orderly merchant ships. The town has streets and buildings and churches. Everything is proper and legal and respectable. But if you listen carefully, you might hear echoes of that wilder time, ghostly voices in the wind, memories of men who chose freedom over safety and paid the price with their lives. The legacy of the Golden Age pirates is complicated and contradictory, much like the pirates themselves. On one hand, they were thieves and sometimes murderers who caused genuine suffering and disrupted legitimate commerce. They cannot be romanticized without acknowledging their victims, the sailors killed in battles, the passengers robbed and terrified, the merchants ruined by lost cargoes. Piracy was a crime, and pirates were criminals, whatever else they might have been. On the other hand, the pirates represented something that resonated deeply with people then and continues to resonate now, the possibility of escape from oppressive systems, of creating alternative communities based on different principles, of choosing how to live even if that choice led to danger and death. In an age when most people had no voice in their governance, pirates voted. In an age when wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, pirates shared their plunder relatively equally. In an age defined by rigid hierarchies of class and race and nation, pirate ships were cosmopolitan and surprisingly egalitarian. This is why pirate stories have endured. It's not really about the treasure or the adventure, though those elements appeal to our imaginations. It's about the fantasy of freedom, of a world where the rules are different, where ordinary people can challenge power and sometimes win, at least for a while. Every generation has reinvented pirates in its own image, projecting contemporary concerns onto these historical figures, because the core narrative, the rebel against authority, the outcast who becomes powerful, the person who chooses how to live despite consequences, remains compelling. Consider how pirates appear in the historical record versus how they appear in popular culture. The historical pirates were often brutal, usually short-lived, and almost always ended badly. They lived in discomfort and danger, died young of violence or disease, and left little behind except debts and memories. The mythical pirates, in contrast, are romantic adventurers, living lives of excitement and pleasure, noble outlaws fighting against corrupt authority. Neither version is entirely true, but both contain elements of truth. The reality was more complex than either extreme allows. Let us consider the lives of ordinary crew members, the nameless men who made up the bulk of pirate ships and whose stories are mostly lost. They were the ones who did the hard work of sailing, fighting, and maintaining the vessel. They were the ones who died of disease in tropical ports or were killed in battles that history forgot. They were the ones who occasionally struck it rich but more often struggled to survive. Their names don't appear in the ballads and histories, but they were the foundation on which the pirate republic was built. Imagine one such man, we'll call him Samuel, though he could have been anyone. Born in poverty in Bristol or Boston or Port-au-Prince, he went to sea young because there were no other options. He spent years on merchant vessels or in the Navy, learning to hand, reef, and steer, to read the weather and repair rigging, to live in the narrow confines of a wooden ship. He was poorly paid and badly treated, but he developed skills and a philosophy of endurance. One day, his ship was captured by pirates, and he was given a choice: join or be set adrift. He joined, and for a few years, he lived as a pirate. He participated in captures and shared in plunder. He voted for captains and signed articles. He experienced a rough form of equality that existed nowhere else in his world. Perhaps he was injured in battle and received his compensation according to the articles. Perhaps he fell ill with fever and was cared for by his shipmates. Perhaps he simply enjoyed the camaraderie, the sense of belonging to something larger than himself. And then, perhaps, his luck ran out. The ship was attacked by a naval vessel, and he was captured. He was taken to Port Royal or Charlestown or Boston and put on trial. He stood in court, probably uncomprehending much of the legal language but understanding perfectly that his life was forfeit. He was convicted, the verdict was never in doubt, and sentenced to hang. On the appointed day, he was led to the gallows, perhaps drunk on rum, perhaps defiant, perhaps simply resigned. The noose was placed around his neck, the cart pulled away, and after a few minutes of struggle, Samuel ceased to exist. His body was cut down and buried in an unmarked grave or left to hang in chains as a warning. And that was the end of his story, forgotten almost immediately except as a name in a list of executed pirates. Multiply Samuel by thousands, and you have the real cost of the Golden Age of Piracy. For every famous captain whose name we remember, there were dozens or hundreds of ordinary pirates who lived and died in obscurity. Their dreams of freedom and fortune ended on gibbets or were swallowed by the sea. They were not heroes, but neither were they simply villains. They were people making choices in difficult circumstances, trying to survive and perhaps to live with some measure of dignity and autonomy. Let us turn now, as our journey through this history begins to wind toward its conclusion, to the question of what the Golden Age of Piracy meant in the larger sweep of history. In purely practical terms, it was a relatively minor phenomenon. The number of active pirates at any given time was probably only a few thousand at most. The economic damage they caused, while significant to individuals, was modest compared to the overall volume of Atlantic trade. The period of intense piracy lasted only about a decade. In the grand narrative of empire building and commercial expansion, piracy was a hiccup, an annoyance, not a serious challenge to the system. And yet, piracy had effects beyond its immediate impact. It forced the development of better naval protection for commerce, which contributed to the growth of permanent naval establishments. It pressured colonial governments to establish more effective administration and law enforcement, accelerating the maturation of colonial societies. It created a body of maritime law and international cooperation in suppressing piracy that established precedents still relevant today. It demonstrated that private violence could threaten state interests, pushing governments toward claiming monopolies on legitimate force. On a cultural level, the Golden Age created a mythology that has proven remarkably durable and adaptable. Pirates became symbols of freedom, rebellion, adventure, danger, that could be deployed for various purposes. In the 18th century, they were warnings about the consequences of defying authority. In the 19th century, they became romantic adventurers in novels and poems. In the 20th and 21st centuries, they have been everything from children's entertainment to symbols of digital freedom. The historical pirates barely resemble their cultural descendants, but the evolution of the myth tells us much about the societies that continually reinvent it. Reflect for a moment on how strange it is that we find pirates appealing. They were, by definition, criminals. They stole from people who had worked for their property. They killed people who were just trying to make a living. They disrupted commerce and caused economic harm. And yet we make movies celebrating them, write books romanticizing them, dress our children as pirates for Halloween. Why? Perhaps it's because pirates represent a kind of freedom that seems increasingly impossible in modern life. They lived outside systems, made their own rules, and for a brief time controlled their own destinies. In our world of bureaucracies and corporations and surveillance and debt, where every aspect of life seems regulated and monetized, The idea of simply sailing away and living by your own code has powerful appeal. It doesn't matter that the reality was harsh and usually ended badly. The myth speaks to something deep in the human psyche, a yearning for autonomy and adventure that civilized life cannot fully satisfy. Or perhaps we're drawn to pirates because they were honest about what they were. They didn't pretend their violence and theft were for noble causes. They didn't claim to bring civilization or salvation to anyone. They were outlaws who admitted they were outlaws, and there's something refreshing about that clarity in a world full of hypocrisy. When merchants and nations were stealing on vast scales, through slavery, colonial exploitation, and unfair trade, while claiming moral superiority, pirates at least flew their black flags honestly. Now let yourself drift into the twilight of this era, into the silence that fell after the last pirate flag was lowered and the last pirate captain hanged. Picture the empty beaches where crews once divided plunder, the abandoned harbors where ships once gathered, the silent seas that once rang with cannon fire and shouted challenges. The physical traces faded quickly, wooden ships rot, simple buildings collapse, bones are scattered by time. Within a generation, most of the pirate havens had been so thoroughly civilized that it was hard to imagine they had ever been different. But the stories lingered. Old sailors in waterfront taverns would tell tales of the golden days when pirates ruled the seas, when Nassau was free and Spanish gold flowed like water. The stories grew with each retelling, facts blurring into legend, until it became impossible to separate truth from fiction. And perhaps that's as it should be. Perhaps the truth of the Golden Age lies not in the precise factual details but in what it represented, a moment when ordinary people challenged the established order, when alternative ways of living seemed possible, when the future wasn't yet written. Consider the men who accepted pardons and tried to return to normal life. What was that like for them? After years of freedom and excitement, after voting for their leaders and sharing in plunder, after sailing where they wished and fighting when they chose, how did they adjust to being subjects again, to taking orders, to working for wages that barely covered survival? Some managed it, presumably, grateful to escape the constant danger and uncertainty. Others must have found it nearly impossible, must have looked out at the sea with longing, remembering despite themselves the life they had left behind. And what of the pirates who escaped justice entirely, who sailed away and were never caught, who died peacefully in their beds years later? What did they think about in their final days? Did they remember their pirate years with pride or regret? Did they tell their children and grandchildren, or did they take their secrets to the grave? We'll never know, but we can imagine them lying awake at night, listening to the wind, remembering the feel of a ship's deck beneath their feet, the sound of canvas snapping in the breeze, the wild freedom of a life lived on the edge. Let us visit one last time the places where this history unfolded. Picture the Caribbean islands as they exist now in your mind's eye. Tourist resorts and cruise ship ports, where people come to relax on beaches and swim in clear water, unaware of the violent history these places hold. Nassau is now a modern capital with hotels and casinos. Port Royal, largely destroyed by the earthquake of 1692 and never fully recovered, is a sleepy fishing village. Tortuga is a quiet backwater. The transformation is complete. But if you know where to look and how to see, traces remain. Old forts still stand on harbor entrances, their cannon long silent but still pointing out to sea. In museums, you can find artifacts recovered from shipwrecks, pieces of eight corroded by centuries underwater, boarding axes and cutlasses, the physical remnants of that vanished world. In archives, trial transcripts and newspaper accounts preserve the words of pirates and their victims. The past is not entirely lost, just deeply buried, waiting for those patient enough to excavate it. And in the end, what can we say about the Golden Age of Piracy? Perhaps this, it was a moment when the contradictions of the early modern world became visible and violent. It was a time when people who had been denied everything, dignity, autonomy, prosperity, voice, seized what they wanted through force and created something new, however flawed and temporary. It was an experiment in alternative social organization that succeeded briefly before being crushed by the superior power of nation-states. It was a crime wave that disrupted commerce and terrified merchants. It was an adventure that gave meaning to lives that otherwise would have been spent in poverty and obscurity. It was all of these things at once, and trying to reduce it to a single simple story does violence to its complexity. The pirates of the Golden Age were neither heroes nor villains but human beings responding to the world they inhabited. They made choices, some brave and some terrible, and they lived with the consequences. They tasted a freedom that most people in their era could not imagine, and they paid for it with their lives. They created communities based on principles that were radical for their time and remain interesting today. They committed acts of theft and violence that caused real suffering. They cannot be celebrated without acknowledging their crimes, but neither can they be condemned without understanding their circumstances. As we prepare to leave this journey through time, consider what draws you to this story. Is it the adventure, the romance of sail and sea and danger? Is it the political dimension, the creation of democratic communities in an age of hierarchy? Is it simply the human drama of people making difficult choices in impossible situations? Whatever it is, the Golden Age of Piracy continues to fascinate because it touches something fundamental about the human condition, our desire for freedom, our need for community, our willingness to risk everything for a chance at something better. The waves continue to roll across the Caribbean and the Atlantic, just as they did 300 years ago. The winds blow, the tides rise and fall, the seasons cycle through their eternal pattern. The ocean cares nothing for human dramas played out upon its surface. It accepts all offerings without judgment, the bodies of hanged pirates and drowned sailors, the shattered timbers of wrecked ships, the treasure that sometimes finds its way to the seafloor. The ocean keeps its secrets and goes on forever, indifferent to our stories even as it provides the stage on which they unfold. And perhaps that's the final lesson of the Golden Age of Piracy, that we are all temporary, that even the most dramatic lives fade into memory and then into legend and eventually into silence. The pirates who seemed so fearsome and important in their time are now gone, leaving only stories and a few corroded artifacts. The empires they challenged have themselves largely faded. The ships they sailed have rotted away. The islands they used as bases have been transformed beyond recognition. Everything passes, everything changes, everything eventually returns to the elements from which it came. But while we live, we are the sum of the choices we make, and in that sense, the pirates made interesting choices. They chose risk over safety, freedom over security, adventure over stability. They chose to write their own rules, even if those rules were often harsh and the writing was done in blood. They chose, in the brief span allotted to them, to truly live, to squeeze from existence every drop of experience and feeling, knowing that the price would be high and the end would come soon. As we float now toward the conclusion of this tale, let yourself rest in the gentle rhythm that has carried us through these hours. We have traveled far together, across oceans and centuries, through lives lived large and small, through violence and brotherhood and the peculiar freedom that exists at the margins of the law. We have met men and women who defied empires, who created democracies on wooden decks, who tasted both glory and despair before meeting their ends at the gallows or in the depths. The story of the Golden Age of Piracy is ultimately a human story, full of the complexity and contradiction that characterizes all human endeavors. It reminds us that history is not simple, that people are not easily categorized as good or evil, that every age contains within it the seeds of many possible futures. For a brief moment, in the early 18th century, one of those possible futures seemed to involve a world where pirates ruled the seas, where different forms of social organization could take root, where the rigid hierarchies of civilization might be challenged and overcome. That future did not come to pass. The established powers were too strong, the contradictions within pirate society too great, the historical moment too brief. but the fact that it was possible at all, that for a few years a different world existed in the spaces between empires, remains significant. It reminds us that human society is not fixed, that the way things are is not the way they must be, that people in every age have the capacity to imagine and sometimes to create alternatives to the systems that constrain them. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep or simply towards silence, you carry with you these stories of people who lived 3 centuries ago but whose struggles and choices still echo in our present. You carry the image of ships with black flags sailing into the rising sun, of men and women choosing freedom over safety, of communities created in defiance of all legitimate authority. You carry the knowledge that history is richer and stranger than we often imagine, that behind every simple story lies complexity, that the past is filled with people whose dreams and fears mirror our own. And perhaps, in your dreams, you will find yourself aboard a small sloop anchored in a hidden Caribbean cove, the stars brilliant overhead, the warm wind carrying the scent of tropical flowers and sea salt. Perhaps you will feel the gentle rocking of the ship, hear the quiet conversations of the crew, sense the strange peace that comes from being exactly where you are supposed to be, doing exactly what you are meant to do. Perhaps you will understand, just for a moment, what drew these people to a life that promised hardship and danger but also offered something precious that the legitimate world denied them, the chance to be authors of their own stories, captains of their own destinies, free in a way that most humans in most times have never been. The night deepens around us now, and the stories begin to fade like morning mist beneath the sun. But before we part, let us linger a moment longer with the texture of this vanished world, with the small details that bring history to life and make these distant figures feel real and present. Think of a pirate waking on a ship anchored off some nameless island, his hammock swaying gently with the motion of the waves. He opens his eyes to darkness, for this is the hour before dawn when the night is deepest and the stars shine with maximum brilliance. Around him, he can hear the breathing and snoring of his shipmates, packed into the close confines of the lower deck. The air is thick and humid, heavy with the mingled smells of tar and gunpowder, unwashed bodies and damp wood, rum and tobacco. It should be unpleasant, but to him it is the smell of home, familiar and somehow comforting. He climbs from his hammock, the skill of doing so without falling is one every sailor masters early, and makes his way up to the deck. His feet know the way in darkness, can find the ladder and avoid the obstacles without conscious thought. On deck, the air is cooler and fresher, and he draws a deep breath, filling his lungs with the clean salt tang of the sea. Above him, the stars wheel in their ancient patterns. He can name many of them, for navigation requires such knowledge, and he has spent countless nights studying the sky. There is Polaris, the North Star, steady and unchanging. There is Orion the Hunter, rising in the east. There are the Pleiades, the little cluster the old sailors call the Seven Sisters. The watchkeeper nods to him, acknowledging his presence without words. They stand together in companionable silence, 2 small figures on a small ship on an enormous ocean, part of something larger than themselves yet utterly alone beneath the indifferent stars. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the eastern sky begins to lighten. Black becomes deep blue, then lighter blue streaked with pink and gold. The stars fade one by one, surrendering to the sun. And then the sun itself appears, a sliver of fire on the horizon, and the new day begins. This is the reality of pirate life, not constant adventure but rather long stretches of routine punctuated by moments of intensity. Days spent sailing from place to place, scanning the horizon for prey or threat. Nights at anchor or underway, always with men on watch because danger can come at any time. Hours of maintenance work, the endless tasks required to keep a wooden ship seaworthy, scraping, caulking, splicing, mending, pumping. The monotony broken only occasionally by the excitement of a chase, a capture, a storm, a battle. And always, underlying everything, the awareness that this life is temporary. Pirates know they are living on borrowed time. Every day might be their last. Disease, shipwreck, combat, execution, Death surrounds them constantly, and they develop a peculiar philosophy to cope with this reality. They live intensely in the present moment because the future is uncertain and the past is unchangeable. They form fierce bonds with their shipmates because these might be the last relationships they ever know. They drink and fight and love with absolute commitment because half measures seem pointless when time is short. Consider the psychology of men living under such conditions. Modern people, accustomed to planning for retirement and thinking in terms of decades, find it hard to imagine the pirate's mindset. But perhaps it's not so different from soldiers in combat zones, or people with terminal diagnoses, or anyone facing immediate mortality. The normal concerns of life, reputation, property, future security, lose their grip when death is imminent and unavoidable. What matters instead is the quality of each moment, the authenticity of experiences, the depth of connections with others who share your fate. This might explain why pirates were capable of such generosity toward each other while being ruthless toward outsiders. The crew was everything: family, community, nation, all rolled into one. They depended on each other absolutely, and this created bonds that transcended the usual divisions of society. Men who in the legitimate world would never have been equals. Gentlemen and common laborers, white men and black men, educated and illiterate, became brothers in this liminal space where normal rules didn't apply. They shared food and danger and plunder. They voted together, fought together, sometimes died together. These bonds were real and powerful, even if the society that created them was violent and ultimately unsustainable. Let us consider now the perspective of those who opposed the pirates, the merchants whose cargoes were stolen, the sailors forced to choose between death and piracy, the colonial governors trying to maintain order, the naval officers hunting pirates through Caribbean waters. They too have stories worth understanding, for history is never simple, never one-sided, never easily resolved into heroes and villains. Imagine a merchant captain whose ship has been captured by pirates. He has spent months organizing this voyage, investing his own money and that of his backers. His hold is full of valuable cargo, sugar or tobacco or indigo, that represents the labor of hundreds of enslaved people on plantations. He was almost home, almost safe, when the pirates appeared on the horizon. He tried to flee, but his ship, heavy with cargo, was too slow. He tried to fight, but his crew, half-starved and weakly armed, was overwhelmed in minutes. Now he stands on his own deck while pirates ransack his vessel, taking everything of value, and he watches his fortune disappearing before his eyes. What does he feel? Rage, certainly, at the injustice of it. Fear for his life, for some pirates are known to be cruel to captains who resist. Despair at the financial ruin he faces, the debts he cannot repay, the disgrace that awaits him in port. He might try to bargain, to save something from the wreck of his voyage. He might plead for mercy. He might curse the pirates, or the navy that failed to protect him, or his own bad luck. But in the end, he is powerless, and all he can do is endure and hope to survive. Or consider a naval lieutenant, young and ambitious, commanding a small warship tasked with hunting pirates. He has spent years working his way up through the brutal hierarchy of the Royal Navy, enduring the casual cruelty of superior officers, the boredom of peacetime service, the constant anxiety of never having quite enough money or connections to secure advancement. Hunting pirates offers him a chance for glory and prize money, for captured pirate ships and their cargoes are sold and the proceeds distributed among the captors. He wants this, needs this, for his future depends on distinguishing himself somehow. But pirate hunting is dangerous and frustrating work. Pirates are experts at disappearing into island chains and hidden coves where larger vessels cannot follow. They have informants in many ports who warn them of naval presence. They are often better sailors than naval crews, for they have chosen this life and practice it constantly, while naval crews include many pressed men who never wanted to be sailors at all. Months might pass without encountering pirates, and when encounters do occur, the pirates often escape. The lieutenant burns with frustration, knowing that his career advancement depends on success that seems forever just out of reach. When he finally corners a pirate vessel and forces a battle, he fights with desperate intensity, knowing this might be his only chance. The combat is savage and brief, and when it ends, he has his prizes, captured pirates to bring to trial, a ship to claim, evidence to support his reports. He feels triumph and relief, but also a strange hollowness, for he has just killed men who in other circumstances might have been his shipmates, men who learned to sail in the same navy he serves, men who made different choices but are not so different from himself. These perspectives matter because they complicate the story, preventing us from falling into simple narratives. The Golden Age of Piracy was not a morality play with clear heroes and villains. It was a complex historical moment where multiple groups with competing interests clashed, and where every participant had reasons for their actions, however we might judge those actions from our present vantage point. The merchant whose cargo was stolen had perhaps made his fortune in the slave trade, causing suffering on a scale that dwarfs anything pirates inflicted. The naval officer hunting pirates served an empire that was itself engaged in systematic theft and exploitation on a global scale. The pirate who attacked them was fighting against systems that had denied him dignity and opportunity, but he was also stealing and sometimes killing. Everyone had blood on their hands. Everyone could claim some form of justification. And no one's justification fully excuses their actions. This moral ambiguity is uncomfortable, but it's closer to the truth of human experience than simple stories of good versus evil. History is messy precisely because people are messy, because we contain within ourselves the capacity for both cruelty and kindness, because we respond to circumstances in ways that make sense from our perspective even when they seem incomprehensible to others, because we are all trying to survive and perhaps to flourish in a world that offers no guarantees and few clear paths. Let your mind drift now to the cultural legacy of piracy, to the ways this brief historical moment has echoed through the centuries. Within a generation of the Golden Age's end, pirates were already becoming romanticized. Ballads and broadsides told their stories with a mixture of condemnation and admiration. The general history of the pirates established many of the tropes that persist today. By the 19th century, with the distance of 100 years making the violence seem less real, pirates had become figures of pure romance in novels and poems. Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, published in 1883, crystallized the pirate myth for English-speaking audiences. His Long John Silver, charming, dangerous, complex, became the template for countless fictional pirates to follow. The book's treasure map, its mysterious island, its young hero proving himself against adult dangers, all became standard elements of pirate fiction. Never mind that real pirates rarely buried treasure or used maps, Stevenson's version was more appealing than reality, and it was his version that lodged in the popular imagination. The 20th century brought pirates to new media. Films from the silent era onward featured swashbuckling pirate heroes, usually played by charismatic actors who made piracy seem glamorous and exciting. Errol Flynn's Captain Blood, Douglas Fairbanks in The Black Pirate, countless others reinforced the romantic image. By the time Johnny Depp portrayed Jack Sparrow in the Pirates of the Caribbean films, pirates had traveled so far from their historical roots that they existed in a purely fantastical realm, subject to curses and magic, more superhero than historical figure. Children's entertainment embraced pirates enthusiastically, stripping away the violence and theft to leave only adventure and treasure hunting. Peter Pan's Captain Hook became a buffoonish villain in a children's story. Pirate-themed birthday parties and Halloween costumes proliferated. Talk Like a Pirate Day became an actual observed holiday, however tongue-in-cheek. Pirates were domesticated, transformed from genuine threats into harmless fun. Yet beneath the fantasy, something of the original appeal remained. Even sanitized pirate stories retained the core themes of freedom and adventure, of escaping from normal life into something more exciting. Children playing pirates were not reenacting historical accuracy, they were acting out fantasies of autonomy and power, of making their own rules and going on adventures. The specifics of piracy mattered less than what piracy represented symbolically. And in recent years, pirates have been reclaimed as political symbols in new contexts. Digital pirates, people who share copyrighted content online, adopted the name deliberately, positioning themselves as rebels against corporate control of information. Pirate political parties emerged in several countries, advocating for internet freedom and privacy rights. The Pirate Bay, a file-sharing website, explicitly invoked pirate imagery and rhetoric. In these uses, pirates represent resistance to authority and free sharing of resources, which is at least partially true to the historical pirates' democratic ideals, even if the contexts are vastly different. Consider how strange this is, that criminals from 300 years ago have become symbols deployed for purposes they could never have imagined, that their names and images are used to sell everything from rum to software, that their stories are told and retold in forms that bear little resemblance to their actual lives. The historical pirates would probably find this bewildering. They were not trying to be symbolic, they were trying to survive and perhaps to get rich. They had no ideology beyond immediate self-interest and the rough codes necessary for group survival. They left no manifestos, no theories of government, no carefully articulated philosophies. Yet we have made them into something larger than they were, and perhaps that's inevitable. History is not simply what happened, it's what we make of what happened, the meanings we extract from the past to help us navigate the present. The pirates of the Golden Age provide raw material that each generation reshapes according to its own needs and concerns. They can be warnings or inspirations, villains or heroes, depending on what we need them to be. And in that malleability lies their enduring relevance. As we approach the final shore of our journey together, let us reflect on what this long tale has revealed. We began with the promise of history told gently, designed to calm rather than excite, to inform while allowing space for rest and sleep. We have traveled through the Golden Age of Piracy, visiting its ports and ships, meeting its participants, examining its causes and consequences, its violence and its brief democracies, its legends and its realities. What have we learned? Perhaps that history is always more complex than we expect, that simple stories cannot capture the full truth of human experience. Perhaps that people in every age face difficult choices and do the best they can with limited options. Perhaps that systems of power create resistance, that injustice breeds rebellion, that denying people dignity and autonomy will eventually produce explosive reactions. Perhaps that brief experiments in alternative social organization, however flawed, tell us something important about human possibilities. Or perhaps you have learned nothing specific at all, but have simply spent these hours in gentle company, letting the words wash over you like waves, finding in the rhythm and flow a respite from whatever concerns press upon you in your present moment. That too is valuable. History need not always be purposeful and educational. Sometimes it can simply be a refuge, a place to rest the mind, a reminder that the world is larger than our immediate surroundings and that countless lives have unfolded before ours, each complete unto itself, each worthy of attention and respect. The pirates of the Golden Age are gone now, all of them, even those who escaped execution and died peacefully in their beds. Gone too are the merchants they robbed, the naval officers who hunted them, the colonial governors who opposed them, the tavern keepers who profited from them. Gone are the ships they sailed, rotted or wrecked or broken up for timber. Gone are the islands as they knew them, transformed by centuries of change. Everything that made up their world has passed away, leaving only traces, documents in archives, artifacts in museums, stories that have been told and retold until the truth has been worn smooth like a stone in a riverbed. Yet in another sense, they are not gone at all. They live in the stories we tell about them, in the symbols we make of them, in the lessons we draw from their example. They live in the questions their lives raise about freedom and authority, about justice and law, about how we organize society and distribute power. They live in the fascination they continue to inspire, in the way each generation finds something meaningful in their brief rebellion against the established order. And tonight, for these hours we have spent together, they have lived again in imagination, as real as memory can make them. We have walked the streets of Port Royal and Nassau. We have stood on the decks of pirate sloops as they chased merchant vessels across blue waters. We have felt the fear of impending battle and the exhilaration of capture. We have understood, as much as we can across the gulf of centuries, what drew people to this life and what it cost them. We have granted them the courtesy of attention, the respect of careful consideration, the gift of being remembered. Now the tale is ending, as all tales must. The sun is setting on our journey through time, and the shadows are growing long. In a moment, you will return to your own life, your own time, your own concerns. The pirates will recede back into history, becoming once again names in books, images in films, costumes at parties. The intensity of this focused attention will dissolve, and other matters will claim your mind. But perhaps something will linger. Perhaps when you see the ocean, you will think of the ships that once crossed it, their crews dreaming of freedom and fortune. Perhaps when you hear about rebellion and resistance, you will remember that people have always challenged authority when authority becomes unbearable. Perhaps when you face difficult choices, you will think of those who chose danger over safety and lived intensely in the time they had. Perhaps you will carry forward some small piece of these stories, some fragment of understanding about the complexity of human nature and the strangeness of history. And if you have found comfort in this telling, if these hours have brought you peace or helped you rest, then the purpose has been fulfilled. History can be many things: a record of what happened, a source of lessons, an entertainment, a refuge. Tonight, it has been whatever you needed it to be, and that is enough. The waves continue their eternal rhythm, rolling toward shores and pulling back, indifferent to human drama. The wind continues to blow across empty seas where ships once sailed under black flags. The stars continue to wheel overhead, the same stars that guided pirates and merchants and naval officers, the same stars that watched as men and women made choices that seemed momentous at the time but are now merely history. Everything passes, everything changes, and yet something essential remains: the human desire for freedom, the human capacity for courage, the human tendency to create stories that help us make sense of our lives. So let us end where we began, with gratitude for your presence on this journey, with appreciation for the time you have given to these old stories and forgotten lives. Let us end with the gentle acknowledgement that history is vast and we have explored only one small corner of it, that countless other stories await telling, that the past is an ocean from which we can draw endlessly without exhausting its depths. Let us end with the hope that you have found what you were seeking, whether that was information or entertainment, distraction or comfort, stimulation or sedation. Let us end with the recognition that in attending to these stories, you have participated in the ancient human practice of remembering, of keeping the past alive by telling its tales, of honoring those who came before by refusing to let them be entirely forgotten. And let us end, finally, with an invitation to rest. The story is complete. The journey is finished. The pirates have sailed away into history's fog, and we who have followed them can now return to our own shores. Whatever time of day or night you inhabit as you hear these words, whatever circumstances surround you, whatever concerns press upon your mind, give yourself permission now to let them go for a while. You have spent these hours in gentle contemplation of the past. You have traveled far without leaving where you are. You have learned about people whose lives were utterly different from yours yet somehow comprehensible, recognizably human despite the gulf of time and circumstance. Now breathe deeply. Feel yourself present in this moment, in this place. The past is past, the pirates are gone, and you remain, living your own story, making your own choices, sailing your own course through time's ocean. You carry forward what you have learned, what you have imagined, what you have felt during this journey. And that is exactly as it should be. The Golden Age of Piracy lasted barely a generation, but its echoes will continue as long as people tell stories and wonder about those who lived differently, who chose freedom over safety, who challenged the established order and paid the ultimate price. And you, tonight, have been part of that long chain of remembering, part of the process by which the past remains alive in the present. Thank you for sailing these waters with me. Thank you for your attention and your imagination. Thank you for caring about these long-dead pirates enough to spend this time with their stories. May you rest well, wherever you are, whenever you hear this. May you carry forward whatever has been valuable in this telling and release whatever has not. May you find in history whatever you need, whether that is lessons or comfort, excitement or peace. The sea rolls on, the wind blows, the stars shine, and we who briefly walked through history now return to our own time, enriched perhaps by the journey, but content to be home. Safe harbors to you, traveler, and may your own voyage through life be filled with such moments of calm reflection and gentle discovery. The stories will be here whenever you need them, waiting patiently like ships at anchor, ready to carry you away again whenever you wish to sail. Sleep well, rest easy, and know that history will keep its watch while you dream. The pirates have told their tales, the Golden Age has had its moment of remembrance, and now all is quiet save the eternal sound of waves meeting shore, the oldest rhythm in the world, the sound that lulled the first humans to sleep and will lull the last. In that rhythm, in that endless return of water to land, find your own peace, your own rest, your own gentle passage into sleep or silence or whatever comes next in your journey. The tale is told. The night is deep. The past has been honored with attention. And now, with gratitude and warmth and the hope that this time has been well spent for you, I release you back to your life, back to your moment, back to yourself. Farewell, traveler. Until we meet again in some other story, in some other journey through time's endless landscape. Farewell, and rest well, and carry forward whatever light these tales have sparked in your imagination. The ships have sailed. The flags have been lowered. The pirates have taken their final bows and exited history's stage. What remains is memory, story, and the quiet satisfaction of time well spent in contemplation of lives lived fully, however briefly, 3 centuries ago beneath the same stars that shine tonight above wherever you are listening. May those stars guide you gently into rest, as they once guided sailors across dark waters toward unknown shores. Good night.